Alright, so my name is Nicole Darnell, and this is my project for Theater 100 entitled A Meticulous Analysis of Theater History. Alright, so theater began as early as the 8th century in Roman Greece, and there are so many famous playwrights from this time, so I only specifically mentioned the ones that were mentioned in the textbook, but there are definitely a lot more. And during this time, tragedy and comedy were the two main forms of theater. However, while I was reading through the textbook, I noticed there was a third type called a satyr play. I think that's how you say it. And apparently that was when the actors would dress up like goat people and run around, so I thought that was really interesting. One stock feature of the Greek and Roman theater is the idea of chorus. And primarily the Greeks wrote chorus into their shows to have a more dramatic effect, but while the Romans did borrow a lot of elements of Greek theater, they did not really borrow chorus. They kind of did away with that. The Romans did copy a lot of Greek theatrical styles, but they added more action and fight scenes known as paratheatrics. And then the Greek and Roman era ended when they brought theater to Western Europe, and the styles from there developed. So after the Greek and Roman era, we saw the rise of medieval theater, and this was about from the 5th century to the 15th century in Western Europe and East Asia. A lot of the shows had really heavy religious implications, like liturgical dramas and morality plays that was kind of like the big fire and brimstone thing, like, oh, believe this or you're going to hell, and they performed them at a lot of churches, and so I had a really hard time finding specific names of these playwrights, but I imagine the clergymen were probably behind a lot of them. During this period of time, religion was important in every aspect of life. It even said in the textbook that Catholicism primarily permeated every aspect of life, from entertainment to government and everything in between. And it was also during this time that the Protestant Reformation took place, so obviously that had a lot to do with what was going on in the entertainment industry also. And the plays that were put on during the medieval period kind of began to die out because the kings and queens of this time were kind of like, hey, you guys get too rowdy when you go to the theater, so we got to do something about it. So the rulers started to make laws against religious plays, and because of that, the plays became more secularized, and that's how we get to the next era. So next we have the Italian and English Renaissance, and I feel like this is what a lot of people think about when they think of classical theater. So this primarily took place during the 1500s and the 1600s in Western Europe, and notably Italy and England, of course. And there are many famous playwrights from this era. A lot of them have really Italian names, and I am not going to butcher them. So there's those guys, and then there's also English ones like William Shakespeare, Thomas Kidd, and Christopher Marlowe, and I feel obviously Shakespeare is the most famous out of those. Playwrights in this time wrote in a variety of different genres. Shakespeare, for example, traditionally wrote comedies and tragedies and histories. That was kind of like his trademark thing. And the playwrights of this era commonly borrowed styles from the Greek and Roman theaters. Like I said, Shakespeare borrowed the comedy and tragedies. But also they invented a lot of new styles, like Shakespeare's famous for his iambic pentameter. And then it was also common during this time for playwrights to replicate real life on stage, which we'll see later. It's also very important for the realism movement. And also, as I said before, plays during this time were more secularized to stop people from being so rowdy at the theater. And also, yet more Protestant Reformation, and this movement eventually moved into neoclassicism. Alright, so next we have French neoclassicism, and this took place between the 1600s and the 1800s in France. Some more famous playwrights we have from this era is Molière and William Wycherley and William Congreve. So during the neoclassicism era, a lot of the plays had more stricter moral themes, and the good versus evil motif was really, really strong here. And they also drew very strongly on traditional Greek and Roman theater. So, once again, you've got the tragedies and comedies happening. But this time, it's like the bad guy is always bad and is always punished, and the good guy always wins and saves the day and gets the girl and that kind of thing. We also see that again later in melodrama. So one really cool thing about French neoclassicism is that they actually allowed a lot more women to participate in theater instead of the traditional having men dress in women's clothes and play the women's parts, because people were starting to get offended by it. So they were like, oh, well, why don't we just have women play women's parts? That makes a lot more sense. And this era came to a close because Victor Hugo wrote Hernani, and it caused a really big riot and divided everyone in the neoclassicism era. And then they divided into the neoclassicists and the romantics. And then the romantics ended up like winning out and drowning out the neoclassicists. But like that era didn't last long, and then it just kind of went straight to melodrama after that. Alright, and now we've got the English Restoration drama, and the textbook had a very specific year for this one. It said that the movement began in 1660 specifically and lasted up until the early 1700s in England. And it began in specifically 1660 because that was the year that Charles II was restored to his throne, hence the name Restoration drama. Some more famous playwrights from this era are David Garrick, Michel Baron, and Thomas Betterton. And this is also really cool because, like the neoclassicist era, they also allowed more women in theater. So, yeah, this was kind of like a universal thing at the time. They all started letting women participate in theater, which that's great. And then the textbook said that this sounded super weird to me, that the way that the plays were conducted is that the actors stood at the front of the stage and like they were giving speeches to the audience, even when they were talking to each other, and they barely hardly ever showed their profile to the audience. That just sounded super strange to me. And then this period ended because playwrights decided that they wanted to make art copy life more. And then it went on to the next era. And now we have melodramas. Melodramas were at the height of its popularity during the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe and America, and this is because that's when the Industrial Revolution happened. And melodramas were created as sort of a way for people to get away from the awfulness of their everyday life. Like, their lives were terrible, they lived in filthy conditions, their work conditions were terrible, they just wanted to go away and be happy for a while, and I totally get that. So they came to see these melodramas. And some more famous playwrights of the time are these two fine gentlemen whose names I cannot pronounce. So I really like the idea of melodramas, but one of the obnoxious things about it is that all their characters are the same. They're all two-dimensional stock characters, and there's always a good guy, there's always a bad guy, and there's always the heroine, and the good guy always beats the bad guy and gets the girl, and it's really irritating. It's got more the good versus the evil motif, and the realists kind of had enough of that. They're like, that's dumb, that's not how that happens in real life. We want to create a style of theater that is more representational to real life, and that's where we get realism from. And now we have realism, which began in the late 19th century. Some more famous playwrights of that day are Ibsen, Strindberg, Bosco, Chekhov, and George Bernard Shaw. And many outside factors, environmental factors, affected the playwrights and their material, such as ideas presented by Charles Darwin and Sigmund Freud. Basically what happened is that the realists were sick of the melodramatists, and they didn't like that the melodramatists were going to theater to escape their problems. The realists were like, hey, let's use theater as a medium to criticize what's going on in our society. it would be wonderful for that. So that's what they did. They wrote plays about societal issues and how they wanted to fix them and resolve them, and how societal issues affected people in general. And actually, really, there were a lot of anti-realism movements that came about because of that, and their main goal was to reinstate like the happy, fun times that melodramatists came up with. And lastly, we have the postmodern era. According to the textbook, the postmodern era begins primarily after World War II, and I would say that it's still ongoing, but its presence was heavier felt in the 1960s and 70s. Some specific examples mentioned by the textbook are Jonathan Miller's Mahogany, Julie Taymor's version of The Lion King, and Samuel Beckett's Act Without Words. Postmodernism really emphasizes how truth is relative and plays